March 1st, 1896, on a mountain plateau in East Africa, tens of thousands of African warriors stood against the guns of a European empire. Italy came to conquer. Italy came to colonize. Italy came certain of victory. By nightfall, one of the mightiest colonial armies in the world would be shattered, and Africa would rewrite the rules of empire forever. This is the story of Adwa, not a legend, not a myth, a real battle fought by real men and women that changed the course of history and that most of the world was never taught. By the end of this film, you will understand how a nation armed with rifles, spears, and unshakable resolve defeated a modern European army equipped with artillery and machine guns. You will understand why this single day still unsettles the story empires like to tell about themselves. If you want more forgotten battles and untold history brought to life, subscribe now, because this story is only the beginning. To understand Adwa, you have to understand the world that made it possible. In the 1880s, European powers gathered in Berlin to divide an entire continent among themselves, without a single African representative in the room. Britain, France, Germany, and others carved borders across Africa as though it were empty land waiting to be claimed. Within a few short decades, nearly the whole continent had fallen under colonial rule. Italy arrived late to this race for empire. Unified only in 1861, Italy was determined to prove itself among the older, more powerful nations of Europe. It looked to East Africa along the Red Sea coast and began carving out a colony it called Eritrea. From there, Italian eyes turned toward a larger prize, the ancient highland kingdom of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was unlike anywhere else on the continent. It had never been colonized. Its roots stretched back thousands of years through empires, kingdoms, and a Christian tradition older than most in Europe. By the late 19th century, it was ruled by Emperor Menelik II, a shrewd and determined leader who had spent years consolidating power, modernizing his military, and unifying diverse regions and peoples under a single crown. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Wuchale. On paper, it was meant to define friendly relations between the two nations, but the treaty had two versions, one in Amharic, one in Italian, and they did not say the same thing. The Italian version claimed Ethiopia had agreed to conduct its foreign affairs through Italy, effectively reducing it to an Italian protectorate. Menelik had agreed to no such thing. When Italy began presenting Ethiopia to the world as its possession, Menelik formally renounced the treaty. Italy refused to back down. The stage was set for war. General Oreste Baratieri commanded Italy's forces in East Africa. He was experienced, but he badly underestimated the army he was about to face. In the eyes of many European commanders of the era, African armies were disorganized, poorly armed, incapable of standing against a modern European force. Baratieri built up his troops in Eritrea, Italian regulars alongside colonial Ascari soldiers, backed by modern rifles and mountain artillery. He believed the coming campaign would be swift, and that Ethiopian resistance would collapse quickly. Menelik saw the danger clearly. He issued a call to arms that reached across Ethiopia's regions and ethnic groups, Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, and many others, uniting them under one national cause. It was an extraordinary mobilization. Tens of thousands of men left their homes, farms, and villages to march toward the northern highlands, some traveling for weeks across brutal mountain terrain, carrying their own supplies, rifles, spears, and shields. Standing beside Menelik was Empress Taitu Betul, his wife, and a formidable political and military figure in her own right. She had pushed for resistance from the beginning, and she took an active role in strategy and command, including leading troops during the campaign. Her presence was a reminder that this was not simply a war fought by men in the field. It was a national mobilization, driven by leadership at the very top of Ethiopian society. Getting an army of this size to the battlefield was itself an achievement. Estimates suggest Ethiopian forces eventually numbered around 100,000 men, though not all were equipped with modern firearms. Some carried rifles obtained through trade and diplomacy with other nations, including France and Russia, who had their own reasons for wanting to see Italy checked in the region. Others carried traditional weapons. Feeding and supplying a force this large over mountainous terrain for weeks at a time was a logistical challenge that would have strained even a modern European army, and Ethiopian commanders pulled it off. Italian intelligence began reporting the scale of the Ethiopian mobilization. Baratieri received warnings that he was facing a force far larger than anything he had prepared for. Rome, impatient and eager for a quick colonial victory to boost its prestige in Europe, pressured him to act. Baratieri, caught between the reality on the ground and political pressure from home, made the faithful decision to advance. The battlefield itself would become a weapon. Adwa sits among steep mountains, deep ravines, and terrain that shifts without warning, perfect for ambush, disastrous for coordination. On the night of February 29th into March 1st, 1896, Baratieri ordered his forces to advance under cover of darkness, hoping to seize high ground before dawn. It was a decision made in unfamiliar territory, using inaccurate maps at night against an enemy whose numbers he had already underestimated. The Italian force numbered around 17 to 18,000 men, organized into separate brigades under different commanders: Albertone, the Bormida, Arimondi, Elena. In the darkness and confusion of the mountain terrain, these columns became separated from one another. Communication broke down, some units advanced too far, others lagged behind. By the time the sun rose on March 1st, the Italian army was no longer one force. It was several isolated pockets of men scattered across unfamiliar ground, unaware of exactly where their allies stood. Ethiopian forces, far more familiar with the terrain and moving with the advantage of overwhelming numbers, began to converge. General Albertone's brigade, advancing furthest ahead, was the first to make contact and the first to be overwhelmed. Wave after wave of Ethiopian fighters pressed forward, using the mountains and ravines to encircle and trap the separated Italian units one at a time. The brigade commanded by General de Bormida suffered one of the worst fates of the day. Ordered to move in support of the main force, his men instead marched into a narrow valley where Ethiopian forces surrounded them from higher ground on all sides. What followed was less a battle than an annihilation. Few of the Bormida's men escaped, and the Bormida himself was killed, his body never recovered from the battlefield. At the center of it all stood Emperor Menelik, directing the battle with striking composure. He held a substantial reserve force back through the early hours of fighting, watching the collapse of the Italian formations before committing his remaining strength at precisely the moment it would break what remained of Baratieri's army. It was not chaos on the Ethiopian side, it was command. By early afternoon, the battle was effectively over. The Italian army, or what remained of it, was in full retreat, fleeing back toward Eritrea in disorder. What had begun as a colonial campaign meant to demonstrate Italian dominance had ended in one of the most complete defeats a European army suffered on African soil during the entire colonial era. The human cost was staggering. Italian losses numbered in the thousands killed, with thousands more wounded or taken prisoner, a defeat rate rarely seen in European colonial warfare of the period. Ethiopian losses were also significant, with thousands killed or wounded in the fighting, a heavy price paid to defend their sovereignty. But the outcome was undeniable. Africa had defeated Europe on the field of battle, decisively, and the world could not ignore it. In October 1896, Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa. It formally recognized Ethiopia as a fully independent sovereign nation and nullified any claim Italy had made under the earlier Treaty of Uchali. Ethiopia had not simply survived Italy's invasion, it had forced an imperial power to publicly retract its ambitions in writing. The shockwaves reached far beyond the mountains of Adwa. In Rome, news of the defeat triggered public outrage and a political crisis so severe it contributed to the fall of the Italian government led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi. European newspapers, which had spent decades assuming African resistance would inevitably crumble before modern armies, were forced to grapple with a very different reality. Colonial powers across the continent took notice. The idea that African nations could not stand against European militaries had just been publicly and decisively disproven. Ethiopia emerged from Adwa as the only African nation to successfully resist full colonization during this period of history, standing as an independent kingdom while nearly every other nation on the continent fell under foreign rule. It would remain that way, with the brief and brutal exception of Italy's occupation during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War in the 1930s under Mussolini. Itself, in part, an attempt by Italy to avenge the humiliation of 1896. Even then, Ethiopian resistance continued, and the country's independence was restored within years. The legacy of Adwa reached far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Across a continent being carved up and colonized, news of an African army defeating a European empire spread as a symbol of what resistance could achieve. In the decades that followed, Adwa became a touchstone for Pan-African thought, referenced by independence movements and Black intellectuals across Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States as proof that colonial rule was neither natural nor unbeatable. Ethiopia's unique status as an uncolonized African nation carried enormous symbolic weight throughout the 20th century. It became a founding member of the League of Nations, one of the only African states to hold that position. Its emperor, Haile Selassie, later became a global symbol of African dignity and resistance, particularly after Italy's invasion in 1935 drew international attention and outrage. Ethiopia's example influenced the Rastafarian movement, decolonization movements across Africa in the mid-20th century, and generations of activists who pointed to Adwa as proof that African peoples could confront and defeat imperial power. Today, Adwa is remembered in Ethiopia as one of the defining moments of national identity, commemorated annually as a day of pride and unity. Across the wider African continent, it remains one of the clearest historical answers to the myth that colonization was inevitable or that resistance was futile. It was neither. It was a choice made by real people under real leadership at a real cost, and it succeeded. Adwa was not just a battle, it was proof that empires could be broken, that unity could overcome superior weaponry, and that Africa would not be written out of the story of its own history. Their spears are gone, their names are not. If this story moved you, subscribe for more forgotten battles and untold history most people were never taught, and leave a comment below. Which empire do you want us to cover next?